Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So last week I did a review of the two subclasses in Mythic Odysseys of Theros, and those were the College of Eloquence Bard and the Oath of Glory Paladin. And I might do a build for an Eloquence Bard at some point, but you actually probably don't need my help there. The one that gets a little more flack is the Oath of Glory Paladin. A lot of people didn't like that subclass, and I showed some of the negative comments towards it in last week's video. So that was the reason I wanted to do the Oath of Glory Paladin, because I think if we're going to be talking about making an effective character, that's probably the one where people need a little more guidance. So that is what we're going to be doing today, is we're going to be making an Oath of Glory Paladin. But before we do that, I want to thank some of my patrons. Now I have a Patreon, and if you join it, then you will be getting these videos early access, and you'll be getting them without the ads. So if you are interested in joining my Patreon, there is a link in the video description down below. But my top level patrons also meet me for a one-shot once a month, and some of those top level patrons that I want to recognize today are Ben Potts, Geek Dice, Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, Nick Lutz, Hendry Eleveld, Scott Ballantyne, Matthew, Dave Peters, and Hootie. Thank you all so much for your support. Thank you to all my patrons. But now let's talk about the Paladin. Let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about when we are talking about paladins is multiclassing, because this is going to be the elephant in the room here. Because if we are min-maxing a paladin, I mean just looking at the absolute best way to make the paladin as effective as possible without worrying about concept, then our choices are pretty clear. The first thing is we want to be multiclassing Hexblade. If we want to be using a two-handed weapon, we might want to go with 3 levels of Hexblade, and that way we could be using that weapon using our Charisma modifier. So you're swinging around this gigantic halberd, and you are using your Charisma modifier for it because Hexblade. But a single level dip in Hexblade is plenty if we're going to be using a paladin that's going to be using a one-handed weapon. This gives us so many different things. It gives us the Hexblade Curse. The Hexblade Curse is huge on a Paladin because it is a massive boost to your offense. The second thing we're going to get is we're going to get the ability to use our weapon with Charisma modifier. And the Charisma modifier is important for a Paladin as well, because that affects things like their aura that boosts saving throws. And so just being able to focus on one ability score is a huge advantage to a Paladin. The third thing is we're going to get access to the shield spell, and shield spell is huge for a paladin too, because a shield spell, of course, on top of heavy armor and shield, is going to give you an almost unhittable armor class. So going Hexblade just makes a ton of sense from a min-max perspective. The other thing you might want to do with a paladin is multiclass a full casting class, and most commonly you're going to take Sorcerer. Now, we already have access to the shield spell, and that's one of the things we would want Sorcerer for, but Sorcerer's also going to give us other things like Quicken Spell, and Quicken Spell can be used with cantrips, and two of the cantrips we will probably be taking are Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade. And then we have Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade working as a bonus action attack after an attack action. Very effective. Also, we're going to get more spell slots that way, and more spell slots means more smites. In that way, we might even find that a lot of paladins are going to multiclass with things like Bard. Again, Bard is an easy multiclass for a paladin, and again, we can get more spell slots, and we can get things like Inspiration and other abilities that are also based off our Charisma. So does that mean that the straight paladin is dead? That going 20 levels of paladin is just something you don't do? Well, today what I want to do actually is make a straight paladin build. I'm not going to dip Hexblade. I'm not going to multiclass with Sorcerer or Bard. This is just going to be 20 levels of paladin, and the reason I want to do this is I want to see how effective it is. Now, one of the things that we might find with a lot of straight paladin builds, again if we are min-maxing, is the use of a halberd or a glaive. Now the reason we would see a lot of halberds and glaives with Paladin builds is so we can make use of both the Polearm Master feat and the Great Weapon Mastery feat. And combining those two feats together is effective offensively. My issue with those isn't that I don't think they're good, it's that it doesn't fit my concept this week. Because when I got Mythic Odysseys of Theros, it inspired me to make Greek-themed characters. And the glaive and the halberd are not Greek-themed weapons. My other issue with going with a glaive or a halberd with a paladin is that when I get to level 5, one spell I'm definitely going to want to take is Find Steed. And the reason I want Find Steed is because mounted combat is pretty good. And we're going to talk more specifically about mounted combat when we add that spell to this build. Because there are some rules that are a little ambiguous there. And I want to talk about what it says by Raw and how that affects how we're going to play this character. But one way or the other, I'm going to want a steed, and I'm going to want to ride that steed. Now, there is nothing in the game that says that you can't use a halberd or that you can't use a glaive from horseback. In Greece, didn't happen. In Greece, what they would use from horseback is usually a spear. That was the standard, though sometimes a sword. And generally on foot, that's what we would see from Greek hoplites, is the use of a spear or potentially a sword. So although there's no mechanical reason not to do it that way, there is definitely a thematic or concept reason that I'm not going to be doing it that way. However, I can take advantage of the Polearm Master feat with a spear, and so I do want to make the best possible effective character within the concept that I have going. And what I want to do is I want to look at, so if I don't take Great Weapon Mastery, if I don't dip Hexblade, and then I don't multiclass into Sorcerer or anything like that, is this still an effective character? Can I make good decisions and still have the character be effective offensively, be effective defensively, be effective in terms of spellcasting? So let's take a look, and I have done the math for it, and I will show you that math as we continue in levels. As usual, when I do my build videos, I post a link that brings you to the completed version of the build. That link is in the video description. So what I've done here is I've made a character, and we are going to call him No Guts, No Glory. And I've enabled Magic the Gathering content because Mythic Odysseys of Theros is technically Magic the Gathering content, though it is generally just inspired by ancient Greece. For the race, I'm going to be going with Variant Human. Human, of course, thematically fits with the ancient Greek warrior that I'm going for, and Variant Human gives us some great stuff. The first thing that I'm going to get is I can increase 2 ability scores of my choice, and I'm going to be choosing Strength and Charisma. These are just no-brainers for Paladins. Those are the 2 things we are definitely going to want. Then we're going to get a bonus skill, and I am going to be taking the Perception skill. Then we get a bonus feat, and of course, with Variant Humans, this is the big thing, and we are definitely going to be taking Polearm Master. This is going to work exceptionally well with the spear. Now, if you have an old printing of the Player's Handbook, you're going to want to look at the feat after the most recent erratas that allow the spear to do the things that all the other weapons in the feat can do as well. So when we take the attack action on our turn with a spear, we're going to be able to use our bonus action to make a melee attack with the opposite end of the weapon. That is going to give us a D4 bludgeoning damage plus our strength modifier, and that is going to give us 2 attacks right on first level. The second thing that's going to happen is whenever a creature enters our reach with our spear, it's going to provoke an opportunity attack. Now, in terms of the math, that's hard to do when we're talking about damage per round because we don't know how often that's going to happen. So what I've done is I've made the assumption of once per combat. Might be more than once per combat, but that is the assumption I made for the math that I did. Obviously, at level 1, we are going to be going Paladin. The nice thing here, we are going to get heavy armor proficiency right off the bat. We are going to get shield proficiency right off the bat. We're going to get martial weapon proficiency, though technically a spear is a simple weapon, so we actually probably only need simple weapons. And then we're going to have D10 hit points, which is going to give us a starting hit points of 12. Not too bad. We're going to be picking 2 skill proficiencies, and the proficiencies I'm going to be taking are Athletics and Intimidation. Athletics is important for this build because athletics, if we're ever making a skill check for a jump, is the role that the DM will normally require. And an athletics check is based off our strength, which is good, and we're going to get additional bonuses with it for being a Glory Paladin. The second one, intimidation, because of the character concept I've got, I'm thinking this is an intimidating character, and intimidation is going to be based off our charisma, which is going to be our primary ability score. So these are both good skills for a paladin to take at first level, and I think the right for this concept. We're also going to get 2 additional abilities at first level. The first one is Divine Sense. This gives you the ability to detect celestials, fiends, or undead. And basically what it does is, so you have a creature in front of you, you're wondering if in fact it is a fiend, you use Divine Sense and it will tell you. You can do this a number of times, equal to 1 plus your charisma modifier. For us that'll be 4 times a day at first. That's way more than you need. Divine Sense is something that comes up once in a while. So their uses of this are essentially free, and we're going to be able to use it as often as we ever need it. It's a pretty minor ability, actually. Second ability we're going to get at first level is Lay on Hands. Lay on Hands is a very good ability, and it improves with our level, and it scales really, really well. Basically, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to have a healing pool of 5 times our paladin level that we can give out with an action. So at first level we're going to have 5 hit points. We could give out 1 at a time. That means we could stabilize and bring back from unconsciousness 5 different creatures in 1 day. And clerics cannot do that, but paladins can. And the scaling here is really great. So when we are a 20th level paladin, we are going to be able to heal 100 hit points of damage, either in 1 shot with 1 action, that's more than a heal spell, or we can split it up as we need. The other thing we can do with Lay on Hands is by using 5 points from our healing pool, we can cure our target of a disease or neutralize a poison. So we're basically getting cure disease and neutralize poison as well as a healing ability, all at level 1. That's quite good for a level 1 ability. Now our ability scores for this build we have to use a point buy. A standard array will put us significantly behind here, but point buy, it works quite nicely. With the bonus to strength and charisma we have from being a human, we put a 15 in each of those, and that's going to give us a starting 16 strength and charisma. So 14 constitution is what we're going to have. This is also going to affect our concentration saves. And then I'm going to start with a 10 dexterity. Of course, 10 dexterity isn't very good, but it's better than an 8. Then we're going to be dumping our intelligence and wisdom. For our background, I'm going to be going with a soldier background here. Now because I already have athletics and intimidation, I picked 2 different skills. I'm going to be picking acrobatics and animal handling. The reason I'm going to be picking acrobatics is there are certain times where acrobatics are going to come up in terms of jumping, and there are certain times that acrobatics are going to come up when it comes to maneuverability. This character has a good maneuverability. We're going to want to have as much bonus on that check as we can have, especially considering we don't have a bonus to dexterity. The second one I'm going to be taking is animal handling. Whenever DM requires a roll for riding an animal, usually animal handling is what you're going to be rolling, and we are going to be getting a mount with this character because we are a paladin. And I need to talk about mounted combat in more detail, and I will do so once we get a mount for this character. And then we're going to get a tool proficiency, and it doesn't really matter what it is. I'm going to grab a dice set. Then we're going to choose our starting equipment, and the standard equipment for Paladin is fine here. We're going to begin with a martial weapon and a shield. Now, I'm not really using a martial weapon with this character. I'm going to be using a spear, so I'm going to grab a longbow. I'm not going to be very good with it, but at least it gives me some kind of ranged attack. The simple weapon I'll be taking is a spear. Obviously, that is going to be our primary weapon. We'll be taking the Explorer's Pack over the Priest Pack. Explorer's Pack has what you need as an adventurer. Then we're going to have chainmail and a holy symbol, and the holy symbol is going to be an emblem on our shield. That's going to give us our divine focus just for holding our shield. And then as a soldier, we're going to start with a dagger, set of bone dice. We're going to be proficient in those if it matters, set of common clothes, and 10 gold pieces. So our first level character is pretty simple. What we're going to be doing is using our spear with our shield and our polearm master. It's going to be giving us 2 attacks around at level 1. First attack will be with a d6 plus 3, and the second one will be with a d4 plus 3. we're going to have 12 starting hit points and an 18 armor class. So as a frontliner, we're going to be just fine at first level. I will be showing the math for the damage when we get to level 5. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be jumping this character to level 5, to level 10, to level 15, and finally to level 20, so that we can go over the decisions we're going to make for each of those sections of character development. So as we move our character from 1st to 5th level, the first thing that's going to happen is at 2nd level, we are going to get a fighting style. And that fighting style that we're going to be selecting is the dueling fighting style. What this is going to do for us is it's going to give us a +2 bonus to damage rolls when we use our spear. Spears don't have great base damage. D6 base damage, and then we're doing a D4 damage when we make our bonus action attack. So with the fighting style, we're getting a +2 bonus to each of those damage rolls. That is by far going to be the most effective thing we can be taking with this character. Second thing that's going to be happening at 2nd level, we are going to get spells. And Paladin spells are decent spells. There's a number of good selections, and we're going to go over those in detail. The third thing that's going to happen is Divine Smite. Divine Smite, of course, is probably the most iconic ability that a Paladin gets. An expended spell slot to do extra damage. Base damage is 2d8 for a first level spell. 1 higher d8 for every level above that, and if we hit an undead or a fiend, we get to add an extra d8. So what I find with Divine Smite, I want to talk about it a little bit here, is I find it gets overused. When I see it played at tables, I tend to see the Paladins smite and smite and smite, and next thing you know, they don't have any spell slots left, and the worst thing is they didn't even get to cast any spells. You got spell casting, you didn't even use it. You just used a bunch of smites. So it just feels like a fighter that has a little bit of a damage boost on some attacks. Not unlike we might get with something like action surges. So Divine Smite, I do find it overused, but the one time we always want to use a Divine Smite is if we are taking on a creature that we don't think we're going to necessarily kill with one attack, and we get a critical hit. If we get a critical hit, then we want to throw a Divine Smite because we get double the damage. That's going to be 48 extra damage. If they're undead or fiends, it's actually 68 with 1 first level slot. That's a great amount of damage for 1 level of a spell. So Divine Smiting on criticals, yes. Divine Smitings on every attack or any attack against a tough enemy, I'm not for it. I figure you're much better off using your spell slots for spells. Next thing we get is Divine Health. That makes us immune to disease. Not a big deal. I mean, we can actually cure diseases with our lay on hands, so this is kind of a minor ability. At 3rd level, we will also be choosing our Sacred Oath, and we're going to be choosing the Oath of Glory for this character. And the first thing that the Oath is going to give us is some spells specifically for our Oath. And at 3rd level, we're going to be getting Guiding Bolt and Heroism. Guiding Bolt is a decent spell for a Glory Paladin because it gives us a ranged option. So if we cannot do a melee attack and we want to contribute in some way, Guiding Bolt is actually a fairly decent first level blast spell. Does reasonable damage for the level, 46, has a rider that we get to have advantage on the next attack on that creature, and a range of 120 feet, so really good range. Now we don't have a lot of spell slots, so I wouldn't be using Guiding Bolt very often. Only when I really wanted to contribute, there was no way I could because melee is impossible, then I would consider a Guiding Bolt. The other one is Heroism. Heroism, what it would do is it would give us temporary hit points and make us immune to fear. The thing about Heroism is it uses concentration, and we can expect to be taking a fair number of attacks. We don't have a great concentration save at 3rd level, and so Heroism is going to be tough to keep up. Now, once we shore up that concentration save, then it's not bad because we get a number of extra temporary hit points, and when we lose them, the following round we regain them as long as we didn't lose concentration on Heroism. Now, I'm going to also mention at 5th level, we're going to be getting Enhance Ability and Magic Weapon. Again, I wouldn't normally be casting these spells, but once in a while I would. Enhance Ability is good more for out of combat. Magic Weapon, I would only be using Magic Weapon if I'm facing a creature and it turns out it's going to have resistance or immunity to non-magical weapons. Should that happen, Magic Weapon is a huge boost, uses a bonus action, and once we have it up, we're going to get a +1 to hit, +1 damage, but more importantly, our weapon is going to be treated as magical for the purposes of overcoming resistance and immunity. We will also get Channel Divinity. This is basically, we can use either of these abilities once per short rest. That's how Channel Divinity works for Paladins. And the two choices we're going to have are Peerless Athlete and Inspiring Smite. I think they're both decent abilities. The first one, Peerless Athlete, we use our bonus action, and what it gives us is a 10-minute duration, so a pretty good duration, advantage on Strength Athletics and Dexterity Acrobatics checks. We are proficient in both those skills, so once we throw advantage on top of that, unless the DCs are very, very high, we should be pretty much guaranteed to succeed. We also can carry, push, and drag twice as much, and the distance of our long and high jumps is increased by 10 feet. And this uses distance as normal. When you jump in D&D, it's just movement. So if I jump 15 feet, that requires 15 feet of my movement. The nice thing here is this allows us to jump over a very far distance. It also allows us to jump very high. So what we can be doing is, if there is a creature that's flying, we can potentially just jump up to it, attack it, and then land back on the ground at the end of our turn. And with long jumps, we will actually be able to clear obstacles of 5 feet high. So if there are 5-foot high obstacles, which are fairly common in D&D, because we tend to be going in increments of 5s, we can clear them with a long jump. So we might even be going past multiple obstacles. We might also be clearing difficult terrain, because if we're just jumping over it, then we don't have to face that difficult terrain. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the synergy here with grappling, because with grappling, of course, you're using your athletics. We're going to have a good strength, we're going to have the athletics proficiency, and now we're going to have advantage on that. We can do that pretty easily with a number of different ways. Barbarian in Rage is one of the most common ways, but basically what it also means is we might have a creature that's flying in the air, we jump up to them, we grapple them, then we're going to do a shove action, knock them prone, and then we're going to land on them. So this isn't technically a grapple build. It's not something I'd be focusing on. I've got a shield. That's a bit of a problem with grappling. So it means we would have to put away our spear. But still, when grappling comes up, when the opportunity comes up that grappling is the right tactical move, this character still can do it and do it well. If I'm going into a combat and I expect to be using grappling regularly, then what I want to do is I want to unequip my shield before the combat begins, and that way I can use my one hand for grappling and my other hand for my spear. But in general adventuring, for the purposes of this character, I'm going to assume we're not focusing on grappling. The second thing we get is Inspiring Smite. This is an okay ability. Basically what we're going to be getting is 2d8 plus our level in the class, which is going to be 3rd level when we get this, in temporary hit points that we can give out after we do a Divine Smite. So this is another reason we might want to do a Divine Smite when we don't score a critical hit, because we might want to award either ourselves or an ally some temporary hit points, and with this pool of hit points we can give it all to one person or we can give it to multiple characters. But if we give it to multiple characters, it's not going to be a lot of hit points, so you need to think about that. I'd probably give it in one lump sum, either to myself or to somebody else who really needed some extra hit points. Then we're going to get an ability score improvement at level 4, and we really need to worry about two things here. The first is we have some spells that have somatic components that don't have a material component. And when you have those kinds of spells, you don't want to have your hands full. So that means potentially dropping our spear or putting away our spear just so we can cast a spell. But if we take the Warcaster feat, we don't have that problem anymore. The second thing that Warcaster is going to give us is it's going to give us advantage on concentration saves. With a Paladin, once in a while you're going to be making concentration saves, so having that advantage on that save is a big deal. It really makes a difference when you actually play just how much more you make that save with advantage, because losing your concentration sucks. And the final thing is, if a hostile creature's movement provokes an opportunity attack from us, we can use our reaction to cast a spell at the creature rather than making an opportunity attack. This is something that, if we dipped Hexblade, is huge, because then we can do a green flame blade or more likely a booming blade when a creature enters our reach for the first time. With a 20 level Paladin build, this is harder to take advantage of. We do have spells, but most of those spells aren't the kind of spells that target a single creature and then do something that's going to be more effective than just hitting it. So probably I wouldn't use that third ability with this particular character. I'd be looking at mainly the advantage of the first two abilities we get. And finally, at 5th level, we get extra attack. So now what's going to happen is we're going to be making 2 attacks with our attack action and 1 attack with our bonus action. So we're going to be looking at 3 attacks per round. So between 2nd and 4th level, we will be able to cast 1st level spells only. So we already have 2 1st level spells as a Glory Paladin, and that's Guiding Bolt and Heroism. And the first one I'm going to be taking is Wrathful Smite. And one thing we find a lot of with the Paladin spell list are these smite spells. And these smite spells, in a lot of ways, are worse than a regular smite, but they tend to have a secondary effect. One thing we tend to find with all of them is that they require a bonus action to set up, and they require concentration for up to a minute. The other thing that most of them have is they require that you attack with a melee weapon. And Wrathful Smite is one of those. That's not an issue for us because melee weapon is what we use. What Wrathful Smite does, and what's nice about Wrathful Smite, is when we hit a creature after doing a Wrathful Smite, it needs to make a Wisdom saving throw against our spell DC, and our spell DC at this point is as good as any spellcaster. And they are going to be frightened of us until the spell ends, and that's how long we concentrate on it. And if they want to end it sooner, they have to use their action, and that only gives them a wisdom check against our spell DC. So it is not easy for them to break this. And it is a wisdom check, not a saving throw, so they're not even going to get their proficiency bonus on that. But the frightened condition is a nice thing to have on your enemies. They're going to have disadvantage to hit you. They can't move towards you. So defensively, it's actually really good. It's good for battlefield control. And we do an additional d6 psychic damage. That's not a big deal, but d6 isn't nothing, and psychic damage is reliable. So if we're considering smiting something, we might want to consider doing a Wrathful Smite instead. Second spell I'm going to be taking is Bless. Now Bless is a great buff that helps you and your allies. You pick 3 creatures that get a d4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws. And the saving throws thing I think is often underrated. That bonus to saving throws is huge, but a plus 1d4 to your to hit rolls means a lot of misses are going to become hits. But because Bless requires an action to cast, I wouldn't be casting it during combat. I'd only cast it if I'm able to set up before a combat. The other first level spell I'm going to be preparing is Compelled Duel, and Compelled Duel is okay. And again, I wouldn't be using it often, but I would use it if I have other party members that are in danger from being attacked by a particular enemy, and I would be preferring that enemy to attack me instead. Then I might use Compelled Duel. So it's something that would come up once in a while. It is also a bonus action to cast. It is also concentration. But what happens is the creature makes a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail that saving throw, they have disadvantage on attack rolls against any creature other than us. So that's all our party members are protected by this. It also has to make a wisdom saving throw every time it attempts to move away from us. So now we can use Compelled Duel, and we can force creatures to move towards us, or at least not move towards the wizard. So you challenge a specific enemy with a Compelled Duel spell, move in, they basically have to attack you, you basically have to attack them, and you're going to have this great one-on-one Paladin versus monster duel. We are also going to get second level spells. We're going to have 2 slots for second level spells, and one of those slots I'm going to be using on the Aid spell. The Aid spell is going to increase my hit points and the hit points of 2 other party members by 5. That's a significant boost to maximum hit points. And because this is not temporary hit points, this isn't going to interfere with our Channel Divinity when we're providing temporary hit points. We can do both the aid and the temporary hit points. The other spell I'm going to be taking is Find Steed. So Find Steed is one of my favorite spells. It is a 10-minute casting time, but it lasts indefinitely. So when we cast Find Steed, we bring about a mount that's appropriate for our character. For this particular character, that's probably a warhorse. Instead of a standard warhorse, it's going to have the Celestial, Fey, or Fiend subtype, and we'll make this a Celestial. And it's going to have an intelligence 6, so it's going to be smart for a warhorse. And we can use our action to actually dismiss the steed as well, and then it disappears until we cast a spell again. So this is part of the reason we want Find Steed prepared, is because we will be going into areas where maybe a horse isn't going to fit or it's not appropriate. So we snap our fingers, the horse disappears, and then once we get through that area and we can mount our horse again, we cast the Find Steed spell, and then it reappears at maximum hit points. One thing we'll definitely want for this steed is barding. With barding, you can buy the same kinds of armor that you can buy for yourself, except it costs 4 times more. And I definitely recommend you get the most expensive barding you can afford. So let's talk a little bit about mounted combat. The mounted combat rules in 5th edition or in the Player's Handbook, and they're fairly brief. There's not a lot of them, but there is a lot of debate over how they work. First thing is, mounting and dismounting your mount basically requires half your movement. So our character, with our movement, it's going to require 15 feet of our movement to mount the horse and 15 feet of our movement to dismount the horse. That means we could potentially mount and dismount the horse on the same turn. That's important, and I'm going to mention why. A couple other things to know about dismounting is if an effect moves your mount against its will while you're on it, so maybe it gets grappled and dragged or it's hit by a thunder wave, we have to make a DC 10 dexterity saving throw or we fall off. And if we're knocked prone while mounted, same thing. DC 10 dexterity saving throw or we fall off. And if our mount is knocked prone, then we have to use our reaction in order to land on our feet. Now, controlling a mount is the most important rules for regards of how this character is going to use a mount in combat. Because you can either have it act independently of you or be a controlled mount. And a control mount is what we want to select. And the reason we don't want our mount to be independent is if we do that, then that mount has a separate initiative from us. And that means the mount's going to move on its initiative, and then we're going to attack on our initiative. And if we're not next to an enemy at that point, that's a big problem. So in terms of maneuverability, independent mounts are terrible for melee characters. They work okay if you're doing a ranged build. If you're using a bow from a mount, for example, that's acting independently, that can work reasonably well. But if we're doing melee attacks, we want our mount to be controlled. As in, we're holding the reins, we're moving in, and making our attacks. So if we control a mount, what happens is the initiative of the controlled mount changes to match ours when we mount it. It moves as you direct it, and it only has 3 action options: dash, disengage, or dodge. That means our controlled mount cannot make attacks of its own. However, we will get good use out of dash, disengage, and dodge using the mount's action, so as far as I'm concerned, that's just fine. And here's the sentence that gets the most controversy. A controlled mount can move and act even on the turn you mount it. So what this tells us is that when we use our turn to mount the creature, it gets to move and act on that same turn we mounted it on, as in on our turn. That's what this says, by rules as written. So if I mount my creature, yes, it can move on my turn. It can take actions on my turn. Now the question is, does it still have the same turn as you on the following round? Because according to this, the initiative changes to your initiative, but that doesn't necessarily mean it shares your turn. So can a mount move up to an enemy, we make an attack, the mount make a disengage action, and pull us away from that enemy without provoking opportunity attacks? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, it can, as long as we mounted it on that turn. If we didn't mount the creature on that turn, then there's nothing under controlling a mount that specifically says that's possible. So if we read this clinically, what this means is on the turn that we mount the creature, it moves at the exact same time as us. It can move, it can take actions on our turn. If we didn't mount the creature that turn, then it shares the same initiative as us. So like normal with ties on initiative, you pick. One goes first and one goes second. So clinically, that's how it works. So what this means is, technically speaking, if we mount our horse on our turn, then we can use that horse on that turn and it's going to work great. And then if we dismount at the end of our turn, we could mount it at the beginning of the following turn, and so on and so forth, which is pretty silly. But if your DM really wants to be clinical about this, that's how it would work. Now, I think most DMs, once you do this for a couple turns, are going to go, this is dumb, and they're going to come up with what I think is the obvious solution here, which is that the creature is going to share your turn on any turn after you've mounted it. Certainly that's how I would run it, and if your DM doesn't, then you're just going to have to dismount at the end of your turn. And in terms of how it's going to affect combat and how it's going to affect your maneuverability, it's not really going to make much difference. It's just a dumb mental image that you're constantly getting off your mount and getting back on it for no reason at all. And if that's the way your DM wants to run their table, then they can do so, and that's what you got to do. So in my last video I mentioned that a paladin using their horse could move up to an enemy, attack the enemy, and then have the horse take the disengage action and move away from that enemy, not provoking attacks of opportunity because, of course, their rider doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity either, since they're not moving under their own movement rate. And then at the end of their turn, move into a different spot. And I was told in the comments that's not allowed by Raw. It is allowed by Raw. The question is whether you have to mount the creature at the beginning of your turn, and we can arrange that. The other thing I should mention is when we use the Find Steed spell, it shares spells with us. This is also another thing that's a little bit vague. But it says, any spell you cast that targets only you, targets your steed as well. So very likely if we cast something like the Heroism spell, and if we cast it on ourselves, then it would affect our steed as well. So I quickly want to discuss what I call baseline damage. Baseline damage is what I use to determine if damage is effective. And I think if you want to talk about damage being effective, you have to have a baseline. You could calculate it differently than me, but if you're not using a baseline, then they're just numbers. I'm doing 20 points of damage a round doesn't mean anything if we don't know if 20 damage a round is good damage or not. What I use for my baseline is I use a Warlock, and I say the Warlock is going to be casting the Hex spell and then using Eldritch Blast. And that Warlock is going to raise their Charisma at levels 4 and 8. And I'm going to assume that Warlock always has a 60% chance to hit. And that is going to tell me what armor class I'm going to be facing, regardless of what level I'm at. I think this is a reasonable way to do a baseline. The reason I think it's good is because a Warlock does okay damage. Warlock doesn't do amazing damage unless you use some tricks. But it doesn't do bad damage either. It does okay, and it scales at the right points where it seems to always do okay damage. A 20th level Warlock does okay damage with Eldritch Blast, and a 1st level Warlock does okay damage with Eldritch Blast, and it's never great, and it's never terrible. And that's why I like using that as my baseline. So what I've done is some calculations, and I've assumed that the Paladin is only smiting on critical hits once they reach level 2, and they're never smiting beyond that. And I'm not calculating any extra damage for doing things like Wrathful Smites because I don't know when I'll be using that. And I've assumed we're going to be getting an opportunity attack once per combat. I think that's fairly conservative considering we have Polearm Master, but that's what I'm using because I would rather be conservative in this case rather than present numbers that are overinflated. The red line represents the Paladin, the blue line represents the baseline, and what we can see is at level 1, we're comfortably above the baseline. Level 2, because of dueling, it really jumps, but also because we're going to be smiting on critical hits. But dueling is actually the main portion there of why we've really jumped over the Warlock. And then we actually dip a bit at level 4, and the reason we did that is because the Warlock increased their Charisma and we didn't increase our Strength. So those numbers end up a little bit closer together, and at level 5 they end up fairly close together. And the reason for that is because the Warlock is adding so much more with extra attack than we are, because with Eldritch Blast it scales at level 5, they're going to get an extra ray. With that ray it's D10 damage, and they've increased their Charisma, and they're adding Hex damage to that. And although we get extra attack, we're just getting that D6 plus 5, so we're adding less. So we see those numbers get closer together again. And so what we see is we've started above the baseline, we're really doing very well once spellcasting and once dueling comes into play. But by level 5, it is narrowing. That gap has narrowed at level 4 and narrowed even further at level 5. And this is concerning, because Paladins never get a third attack. And so does that mean that eventually the Warlock is going to surpass the Paladin? If that happens, this build doesn't work. Simple as that. Because although we have a decent defense, although we have decent armor class, although we have great maneuverability, although we have a number of control things we can do with spells, You need to be delivering damage as well if you're a melee character. You just need to be. I talk about this with monks all the time, and certainly with paladins. I would expect that you would always be able to beat the baseline, and if we can't do that, then this build doesn't work. So we're going to take this character to level 10 and see what happens. I should point out our lay on hands is continually scaling here, so we are up to 50 hit points we can heal with lay on hands, or 10 diseases or whatever. With our oath spells, we're going to be getting haste and protection from energy at 9th level. And my assumption is we will be using both those slots for haste, and I'll discuss that a little bit more when we talk about spell selection. Level 6, we get one of my favorite abilities of paladins, and that's the Aura of Protection. It is going to give us a bonus to every saving throw we get, equal to our charisma modifier, even the saving throws we're already proficient in, including wisdom, which is an important saving throw. In addition, any creature that's friendly to us, that's within 10 feet of us, shares that bonus, and that is huge. That is huge. It means if you huddle your party together, everyone can get this bonus. And at least, I would imagine, the other frontliners are going to get this bonus, and they need that bonus. And this makes the Paladin powerful defensively, more than just in terms of armor class and hit points. It means that we're now going to have great saving throws. Keep in mind as well that Aura of Protection adds to our concentration saves, and we already have advantage on those concentration saves and an ability score modifier. So that +2 ability score modifier plus the +3 from Aura of Protection means +5 with advantage, which means unless we're taking obscene amounts of damage, we're pretty much always going to make our saving throw for concentration. Makes spells like Heroism a little bit more attractive. Then at 7th level, we're going to get Aura of Alacrity. This is Glory Paladin specific, and it is going to increase our walking speed by 10 feet. In addition, the walking speed of any ally who starts their turn within 5 feet of you increases by 10 feet until the end of that turn. One ally that's always going to be starting its turn within 5 feet of you is your mount. And that's the most important thing about this, is that when you see an ability like this, the first thing I think is, uh-oh, this isn't going to help our mounted combat, because what use is an additional 10 feet of movement when I'm going to be mounted anyway? But then I see that it's going to add to an ally within 5 feet of us, and that includes our mount. So thankfully, our mount will get that additional 10 feet of movement. Mount started with 60 feet of movement, that increases it to 70 feet. Now, there's a lot of question over how valuable is that, and I'm going to have to show you on a battle map. And for our 8th level ability score increase, I'm going to be taking Mounted Combatant. And I have some mixed feelings about this because it really depends on the type of campaign. If you are in a dungeon crawl campaign, and it's a bunch of 5-foot hallways, and this is the way it always is, then you don't want to take Mounted Combatant here. What you want to be doing is increasing your charisma right now. But for this character, I'm going to be taking Mounted Combatant under the assumption that we're going to be able to use our horse most of the time. And this gives us 3 advantages. The first is that we get advantage on melee attack rolls against any unmounted creature that is smaller than our mount. I will tell you that even at the higher challenge ratings, most creatures are medium size or smaller. That means we are going to be getting advantage on our attacks a lot of the time. Second thing is that we can force an attack targeted at our mount to target us instead. And because our mount does not share our hit points, it is pretty important that they get this. The third is if the mount is subject to an effect that has it make a dexterity saving throw to take only half damage, it then takes half damage if it fails and no damage if it succeeds. So both the second and the third abilities will vastly improve the survivability of our mount. Now, it's fair to point out that we have the Find Steed spell prepared, so we could simply cast it again and get our mount back, but we can't do that in the middle of combat. That's a 10-minute casting time. So if we want to have our mount for the combat, improving its defense is important. Like I said, by barding for your mount, and the Mounted Combatant feat will help keep that mount alive. So in terms of the assumptions I made in regards to my damage calculations, I assume we're going to get advantage. I said half the time. I thought half the time is probably pretty close. And finally, at 10th level, our aura that helps all the saving throws improves, and now it prevents creatures from being frightened. So at this point, we're not going to be casting Heroism anymore, but you know what? We had it for 8 levels, and we've probably used it a number of times in there. But yeah, certainly by level 10, I wouldn't be casting Heroism anymore. So as we move towards 10th level, we're going to get additional 2nd level spells, and then we are going to get 3rd level spells. We'll get 2 slots at level 9. So before we get that, we're going to be able to choose another 2nd level spell to prepare, and the one I'm going to prepare is Lesser Restoration. Lesser Restoration can remove blinded, deafened, paralyzed, or poisoned. We can already remove poisoned with our Lay on Hands ability, but blinded, deafened, and paralyzed we can't. So Lesser Restoration gives us the additional ability to remove conditions that we otherwise couldn't remove. So we're going to be really good at removing conditions because we can remove poisoned and diseased both with our Lay on Hands. We can remove blinded, deafened, and paralyzed with our Lesser Restoration spell. Now this is an action to use, so I wouldn't use it unless it's an emergency. But if somebody gets paralyzed in combat, that's an emergency. And that brings us to our 3rd level spells, and this is where I want to talk a little bit about the Paladin spell list at level 3, and specifically that the Paladin spell list at level 3 doesn't work all that well for a character that uses their bonus action every turn, because that's us. Because the best spell, as far as I'm concerned, for Paladins at level 3 is Aura of Vitality. This is a heal spell, and basically we can use our bonus action each turn using our concentration to have somebody regain 2d6 hit points. That's not a bad heal spell. In fact, it's a reasonably good heal spell. We can actually heal 20d6 points of damage with Aura of Vitality. That's a fair amount of healing for a 3rd level spell. But it uses a bonus action every round, so unless we're casting it outside of combat, then Aura Vitality isn't all that great for us because we're giving up an attack to do it. Crusader's Mantle is the other 3rd level spell I hear talked about a lot for Paladins, and for most Paladins I don't recommend it. It is going to require an action to cast, which means we can't take our attack action on the turn we use this. And if we can't take our attack action, then we can't even use our bonus action, because we have to use our attack action to get our bonus action attack. And the duration on this isn't long, it's 1 minute. Which means unless we can prepare this immediately before a combat begins, then we're going to be giving up an entire round of combat in order to cast this. And what it's going to do is it's going to give us a d4 radiant damage with weapon attacks. Now, the nice thing is it helps other creatures as well, but unless you have a whole bunch of creatures making attacks, it's not going to be worth it to use your first turn of combat to cast this spell. And what I'll tell you is overall, this is not a great spell list at level 3 for Paladins. Dispel Magic is decent. Daylight sucks. By the way, Daylight doesn't create daylight. It creates light, but it's not daylight. Crusader's Mantle, only useful in cases where we specifically optimize around it. Create Food and Water, I mean, it's okay for utility. Blinding Smite's okay as a smite spell, but it's not a great one, and Wrathful Smite's probably just as good as a level 1 spell. At least Blinding Smite offers a significant amount of additional damage, but I don't think it's a great spell. Aura Vitality I think is a pretty good spell, but not good for our character. Magic Circle, hard to use. Elemental Weapon is not a great spell. It requires an action to cast instead of the bonus action that Magic Weapon requires. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's not great. Remove Curse, super circumstantial. I mean, it's nice to have on there in case somebody gets cursed, then the next day you can prepare Remove Curse, but I don't want to keep it prepared all the time. And then Revivify is a good spell, but hopefully on any given day we're not going to need it. And I would certainly think that on the average adventuring day you're not going to be casting Revivify. So what you end up is with a situation where what are you going to prepare? I mean, I'm going to prepare Revivify because it's a good spell. And I'm going to prepare Detect Magic because it is also a good spell. Though again, just like Revivify, I don't know when I'm going to need it. And so what I end up with is preparing 2 spells that I don't know when I'll be casting them. But here's one spell I can definitely cast, and that's Haste. And I'm going to get that through the Oath of Glory spell list. I'm not convinced it's the best spell that any Paladin gets. That's probably Oath of the Crown because they get Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians is a better spell than Haste. Like, let's just be honest here. If we can get Spirit Guardians with our Paladin, that's the Holy Grail. But if I can't get Spirit Guardians, I'll take Haste. And I think Haste is okay for this build in particular. Like with the Crusader's Mantle, this is an action to cast with concentration up to a minute. Now I talked about action to cast, bad for Crusader's Mantle. Here's why it's not so bad for haste. Because on the turn we cast this, we will be getting an additional action. And if we take the attack action, we only get one weapon attack. And that's a disadvantage. It means we can't use our extra attack feature. But because we've taken the attack action, it does qualify us for a Polar Master bonus action attack. So that means instead of making 3 attacks on round 1, we make 2 attacks on round 1. That's a lot better than making 0 attacks. And on following rounds, we're going to be able to take 4 attacks. So this is what I would probably be spending the majority of my 3rd level spell slots on. In fact, on the average day, I'd probably spend both my spell slots on the haste spell for this character. It does increase our damage. I've done the math. But in addition to that, it doubles our speed, it increases our armor class by 2, and advantage on dexterity saving throws. And the other nice thing about haste is because it is a single target spell, and because we're only going to be casting it on ourselves, our steed also gets haste. That's a +2 armor class for our haste. That means our haste is going to double their speed. So this means 140-foot movement for our found steed. An advantage on dexterity saving throws is really nice for our creature because remember, if they're making a dexterity saving throw to avoid damage and they make their save, they take no damage. And taking 2 actions is still something we can be using. That means that we could combine something like the dodge action and then with their hasted action disengage, and then attacks against them would have disadvantage and they would not be provoking attacks of opportunity. Or if we needed to move really far, they could take the dash action. They could even take the dash action twice. How far would that be? Well, it'd be 140 times 3, which is 420 feet of movement in 1 round. Take that, monks. Of course, in practicality, we're never going to need to be moving 420 feet in 1 round, but if we did, we could. So I want to just show you really quickly on a map how that the Aura of Alacrity can be useful for a paladin beyond just themselves and their mount. So of course there's many situations where it could occur, but I'm told there's no situation where it could occur. So I'm going to show you one, and one I think that could come up reasonably often. So we have our paladin right here. They are the mounted character. And beside them, we have 2 party members that are also frontliners. Why are they close to the paladin? Well, they're close to the paladin because they want to get those saving throw bonuses. Good thing because we got a couple spellcasters on this side of the map, and they might be casting spells at us. So on our turn, this is what we can do. So if we look, it is going to require us 40 feet of movement to get to this enemy. So we take 40 feet of movement and we move to that enemy. Then we can use our attack action as normal. Now if we didn't have haste cast on our mount, well, our mount probably wants to take the dodge action at this point and not take any damage. And our Aura of Alacrity isn't really going to make any difference. It's not going to make any difference to us. We didn't need to move more than 40 feet. It's not going to make any difference to our allies because they're not going to start their turn next to us. But if we have the haste spell up, then not only are we going to be making additional attacks, and not only are we and our mount going to get an additional armor class bonus, but our mount is going to have double the movement and be able to take 2 actions. So the mount no longer needs to take anything like the dash action to get back to our allies. It's only moved 40 feet, has 140 feet of movement, no problem. And in addition, our mount can take 2 different actions. The first one they probably want to take is disengage, because they want to move away from these enemies. They don't want to provoke attacks of opportunity. But in addition to that, we probably want to have them take the dodge action as well. And that means any attacks against them are going to have disadvantage as well if we don't want to have those attacks go at us. And sometimes we won't. If they're going to be missing our mount anyway, great. So we're going to use another 40 feet of movement, move back to our allies. We don't provoke any attacks of opportunity. Our mount is a very difficult target for our enemies, and at the beginning of our turn, our 2 slow allies will now have a 40 feet of movement, so they have enough movement to get up to the enemies. Obviously, this is only one example, but anyone who's telling me there's no examples, there's one example. There's many more we could come up with. Maybe there's difficult terrain and they could use that additional movement. There's so many things that can make it so that movement is helpful. And maybe it is that a lot of people have just heard my words talking about monks where I say that the mobility isn't great for monks, and they assume that that means mobility isn't good. No, mobility is good, especially when you put it on a character that's effective in melee combat. Then mobility is really good. And so giving our Paladin fantastic maneuverability with a mount, with Aura of Alacrity, with haste. These things are great on a melee character, and they will be great for your other party members as well if they are effective melee combatants. If they're not effective, so they're monks and they go into melee and they can't deliver effective damage, they can't really do anything useful, and then mobility's not that great. But if you are a good melee character, then it's definitely useful. So here's a graph again, and we can see at level 5 we were quite close. Level 6 and 7 remain the same. Then at level 8 the baseline increases a little bit, but our Paladin increases a lot. And the reason it increases a lot is we just got Mounted Combatant. Then we are going to go up again at level 9, and the reason we go up at level 9 is because of the haste spell. So between Mounted Combatant and the haste spell, we have gained a greater gap between ourselves and the baseline than we've had up to now. This is partially due to the spell list that only the Glory Paladin has. Now, to be clear, what I've done here is I've assumed that the mount is going to give us advantage half the time, and I've assumed that haste is something we will be casting on round 1 of 2 combats in a 4 combat day. If you have more combats than that, the benefit of haste is less. If you have less combats than that, the benefit of haste is more, potentially twice as more if we only have 2 combats or 1 combat in a day. The other thing I want to mention is if we have a chance to prepare for combat and we cast haste beforehand, then this number would increase more as well. I'm assuming we're going to have to take the worst case scenario and we're going to have to cast it in combat. So what happens if we lose our concentration on haste? Well, potentially we'll be looking at our level 8 damage instead of our level 9 damage. That's the difference. So we're still well above the baseline if we lose our haste for some reason. But we won't lose it often. Remember, we're looking at a +5 saving throw and with advantage. So I want to jump again up to level 15 and see what happens from there. Now this is something that we're just not seeing with Paladins very often. Generally, I see Paladin builds jump out of Paladin at level 6, or sometimes at level 7, depending on what the Paladin gets as their aura at level 7. So we tend not to actually see a lot of high-level Paladins, but I do think they bring a lot to the table. The first thing we're going to be getting is improved Divine Smite, and this is huge. What it does is every time we make an attack with a weapon, we deal an additional d8 radiant damage. This will include our bonus action attack. This will include our hasted attacks. Now keep in mind that if you're a fighter, you're going to be getting a 3rd attack with your attack action. If you are a Warlock, you're going to be firing a 3rd Eldritch Blast. So we'll have to see how that compares, but that is kind of the offset to not getting that 3rd attack. And with ability score improvement, what you could do here, and I thought about it, is to go with Resilient Constitution. Because Constitution saves are important, and getting a Resilient Constitution would be really nice. It would make it so our concentration would basically never go down. But what I've decided to do is increase my Charisma score instead. And the reason I've done this is because remember that we're not a one-person team. We have a whole group of PCs that are benefiting from our 6th level aura, and by increasing our Charisma score, we're giving a +1 to every saving throw of everyone within 10 feet of us. And that is eventually going to get to 30 feet of us. So basically it's going to be the entire party all the time. For now, it's just going to be the party members that stick close to us, which frankly is going to be most of them because they want this. And we've just increased that bonus from a +3 to a +4, and we get it as well. So we did improve our concentration saves. We did improve our constitution saves. Not by nearly as much, but we've improved all our saving throws. Then we're going to get our 14th level ability. I'm not as big a fan of this. Cleansing Touch. We can use our action to end a spell on ourselves or one willing creature that we touch. Keep in mind that if a creature is potentially dominated or something like that, then they might not necessarily be willing to have that spell ended on them. And if any debilitating spell has been hit on you, you may not be able to use your action. I mean, even if you fall to something like a hypnotic pattern, you don't have your action to remove the effect on yourself. So this is something that isn't going to be easy to use. And it uses our action, and it's limited a number of times equal to our Charisma modifier. Not a big deal. We're probably not going to be using it very often. Then we get our Oath feature, Glorious Defense. This is an okay ability. When we or another creature we can see within 10 feet of us is hit by an attack roll, that should be happening all the time. We can be using our reaction, which we're not using for anything else, to grant a bonus to the target's AC against that attack, potentially causing it to miss. The bonus equals our Charisma modifier. Remember, we increased our Charisma, so this is now a +4. If the attack misses, you can make one weapon attack against the attacker as part of this reaction, and we can use this feature a number of times equal to our charisma modifier, meaning we can use it 4 times. So remember, this doesn't mean we're going to get 4 additional attacks with our weapon, because only if that +4 bonus causes the attack to miss do we get the attack with our weapon. Now, quite often I would say a +4 is going to cause an attack to miss. If an attack was going to hit and you add +4 to the AC, it's normally going to miss. So in terms of damage, what I've assumed is we're going to be able to use this ability and get an additional attack 3 times a day. This is a decent ability because not only are we getting additional weapon attacks, but also 4 times a day when an attack hits us or an ally, we have a pretty good chance of turning that hit into a miss. At 11th level, we're going to be able to cast 3 3rd level spells in a day. That means that we could cast our haste spell in 3 combats a day. And at 13th level, we're going to get access to 4th level spells. So the 4th level spells we're always going to have prepared as an Oath of Glory Paladin are Compulsion and Freedom of Movement. Neither of them are fantastic additions. Considering the level, I consider Compulsion actually a pretty bad spell. Freedom of Movement's okay, but it's something that often you don't know when you're going to need it, and a lot of the times we're not going to need it. So, like I said, neither of those spells really are great. But we do have better Paladin options for 4th level spells now. My favorite 4th level spell, by a mile, is Find Greater Steed. So this is going to give us all the joy of the Find Steed spell, except we can choose from a number of better creatures, and there is no question in my mind what creature we want to pick. Because at level 5 we got Find Steed and we changed from a Hoplite to a Hippeus. But at level 13 we are going to change from a Hippeus to Bellerophon. So there is no question, considering the concept of this character, Pegasus is the way we want to go, and Pegasus is a great choice anyway. So we have a fly speed of 90 feet here. Now this doesn't benefit from our Aura of Alacrity. Who cares? It is a fly speed of 90 feet. If we're hasted, that's a fly speed of 180 feet. And this is a great creature. We have a lot more hit points than a warhorse would have. We have proficiency in 3 different saving throws. An intelligence score of 10. Presumably, this creature can also benefit from armor, just like our warhorse can. We probably can even just transfer over that same armor. Now, I already mentioned that maneuverability is good on a melee character, but massive fly speeds are really good on a melee character too. I'm not going to bother showing you on a map. Just trust me, if you can fly, and you can fly super fast, that's really good with a melee character. And just like the Find Steed spell, this is going to last indefinitely, but you know what? I'm going to keep it prepared anyway. Now I'll mention that Aura of Life is a decent spell, but it is circumstantial. We're probably only going to be wanting to use it against powerful undead, the kind that reduce your hit point maximum. That's when Aura of Life is useful. Aura of Purity is an okay spell, but there is a little bit of redundancy with what a Paladin already does. For example, it gives creatures around you immunity to Frightened. We're already doing that, and we're immune to Frightened as well. But it does give immunity to a number of other effects. A lot of those effects we could remove with a Lesser Restoration or with our Lay on Hands ability. So Aura of Purity is okay, but there is some redundancy. Banishment is an okay spell, but it's not the kind of spell I want to be casting with this character. I don't want spells that require an action, are going to give up all my attacks for, just so I can maintain concentration on them. I mean, you could do that, but then you're really just kind of being a crappy wizard. Death Ward is an okay spell. What it does is if a creature drops to 0 hit points, they drop to 1 hit point instead, and any effect that would instantly kill them without doing damage, unlike a power word kill or something, it negates that as well. And if we cast Death Ward on ourselves, we of course affect our mount as well, and that's good. Locate Creature is purely circumstantial, and Staggering Smite is not one of the better smite spells. So I do think Death Ward is the right choice for us here. And I'm going to take Aura of Life as well, just because I have the preparation slot for it. As an alternative, I might do Aura of Purity. So as we look at our graph against the baseline, we see a huge jump at level 11. We were doing all right at level 10, but now we're seeing just a massive difference between the baseline and our damage, and there's a couple reasons for this. Although the Warlock gets a 3rd attack at 11th level, we are getting improved Divine Smite, and in addition to that, we're getting haste on an additional combat per day, because now we can cast it 3 times per day. And that's it. haste plus divine smite equals big damage. And the tiny increase to damage we're seeing at level 15 is from our glorious defense. Like I said, I'm not assuming very many actual extra attacks with that, but remember we're also improving our defense or the defense of an ally. So here's something we don't see every day. Let's take a straight class paladin to level 20. So let's go over what we get. The first thing is at level 16, we're going to get an ability score improvement. I'm going to increase my charisma again. That's going to get our charisma up to 20. We now have a +5 aura. The next thing that's going to happen is at level 18, our aura is going to improve to 30 feet. So now our whole party should be always taking advantage of +5 to every saving throw they make, whether they're proficient or not. Then at 19th level, we're going to get an additional ability score improvement. Now we could go a number of different ways here. I'm going to increase my strength up to an 18, but you could take the lucky feat, you could take Resilient Con here. There are a lot of decent choices. I think strength is a decent choice as well, because you know what, my saving throws are great, got a pretty good defense, my maneuverability is great. Let's get my offense up a little bit. And finally, Living Legend, this is the Oath of Glory feature, and I'll tell you that I got a lot of people telling me they don't think this is a very good ability. This requires a bonus action to use, and it lasts only for 1 minute. Now the good side is it only uses a bonus action to use. A lot of Paladin Oaths require an action to use their capstone feature. The disadvantage is that it only lasts for 1 minute. Some of the other Paladin Oaths also last for 1 minute, but a lot lasts for longer. What we're going to get, advantage on all charisma checks. Somebody pointed out to me that's advantage on things like dispel magic rolls, and yeah, that could come up, but at level 20, I'm not casting Dispel Magic all that often. But if I did, yeah, there's a bonus there. And then once on each of our turns, when we make a weapon attack and miss, we can cause that attack to hit instead. This does not use our reaction. And what's going to happen is we're going to be attacking 3 times a round, and normally we're going to be hitting 2 times a round. This character will normally be hitting 3 times a round. If we get lucky and we hit 3 times a round, then we don't get a benefit here. And if we're unlucky and we hit less than twice a round, then we get 1 additional hit, but we're not going to hit all the time. But what's going to happen is this character is most of the time going to go from 2 hits to 3 hits. And finally, whenever we fail a saving throw, we can re-roll it. That's a great ability. That is a fantastic ability. It also means that our concentration is going to be almost impossible to bring down now. Now I'm telling you Living Legend is really good. I am not saying it's necessarily the greatest capstone of all the paladins, but I do think it's still a pretty good capstone. So 5th level paladin spells. Most of the time we see these on bards more often than on paladins, because of course bards can select them with magical secrets. And paladins have to get to 17th level to get these abilities. And the most castings we're ever going to get of our 5th level spells is twice. And the spell that I definitely want is Holy Weapon. Holy Weapon is a bonus action casting, but it lasts an hour. That means because of that duration, we probably don't have to do this in combat. So it being a bonus action, it being an action, probably doesn't matter. We're going to cast it on ourselves, and our spear attacks are going to be doing an additional 2d8 radiant damage on a hit. Now there's a secondary effect on this where we can end the effect and then do a burst effect that can cause 48 radiant damage and potentially the blinded condition. But that's not something I'm going to be using very often. Maybe if my duration is just about to end, I might end it that way. But for the most part, I'd be using just the Holy Weapon for that 2d8 radiant damage for an hour. That's a lot of damage. And we have a reasonable amount of attacks. Remember, that's adding to our action attacks, which is twice per round, but it's also adding to our bonus action attack every round. It's also adding to our opportunity attacks when creatures come within our weapon's reach. It's also adding to the extra attacks we're going to be getting through Glorious Defense. So there's a lot of ways that Holy Weapon adds up to a lot of extra damage. I'm also going to prepare Circle of Power. Again, I'm probably casting Holy Weapon with my spell, but I like having Circle of Power prepared just in case, because it's an action cast that lasts 10 minutes, which again means we can often cast it outside of combat because we have a decent duration. Not nearly as good as Holy Weapon for duration, but it might get you to your next short rest. And what it's going to do is it's going to give every creature around us within 30 feet that's friendly to us gets advantage on saving throws against spells and other magical effects. And if we're in one of those cases where it's a half damage spell, if they fail their save, they're going to take no damage instead. And this isn't one of those things that's limited to dexterity saving throws. And remember that at 18th level, every creature within 30 feet of us is also getting +5 on that save. And the last thing we can do with our 5th level spell slots is we can use our capstone again. And this is something that other oaths don't get. If we are in, let's say we're in a 2-combat day, and Holy Weapon is going to serve us for both of those combats, we're not going to lose our 2nd 5th level slot, because we could then use our capstone in both of those combats. So here it is. This is the last portion of the graph. As you can see, at level 17 we get another significant boost, way more than the Warlock is getting with their extra attack, because of Holy Weapon, because Holy Weapon is delivering so much more damage to the attacks we have. So one more attack for the Warlock just doesn't compare. And now again we have the biggest gap we've ever had. Then again at level 19 we're going to see another boost, and the reason we get that boost is because we increase our strength. And then at level 20 there's a skyrocket. Now the skyrocket, I just need to be honest here, isn't going to be in every combat. This is the damage you will see in the combats where we are using our capstone in combination with Holy Weapon. That's when we see the near 100 points of damage a round versus a baseline of under 40 a round. So that to me seems like a pretty big boost. So why is it such a big boost? Well, the reason it's such a big boost is because mathematically what you have to do is, if you're attacking 3 times in a turn, you have to take the chance of hitting 3 times on a turn. And when you have a 60% chance to hit, it means you're going to hit most of the time. But it means that you're going to hit 3 times in a round very seldomly. In fact, it means that almost 80% of the time you will miss at least once. And if you miss at least once, then we're adding our full damage from an attack. Don't have to worry about chance to hit. It's not like an additional attack. It's just if you miss any of those attacks, we get to add full damage from an attack. And there's a bit of extra math determining which attack is going to miss, because of course if we use our bonus action then it's a little bit less, but not a lot less. The difference between our bonus action attack and our main attack at this point is almost insignificant. And by the way, at this point we're still only using smites when we score a critical hit, and we're still only using 1st level slots. So every 2nd level slot, 3rd level slot, 4th level slot, and 5th level slot is available for us for casting spells. If we wanted to use more of those spell slots for smiting, these numbers would go up. I figure keep them for spells. You are a half spellcaster. Get the advantage of that in being able to cast spells. Spells are just way more versatile than just doing a little bit more damage. So that's our Glory Paladin build. This is a shield and spear build. Interestingly, despite the fact we don't add great weapon mastery, we maintain above the baseline for all 20 levels. We start a reasonable amount of the baseline right at level 1, continue along, and then once we get to 7th level, the gap between our damage and the baseline only increases. It increases and increases until we get to 20th level, where we are looking at double or more of the baseline. And this isn't just damage. Now if this was just a straight damage build, I think we could do better than that. I think we could actually do a fair bit better than that. But this will be definitely effective damage in combat, and we are adding it. We're adding it to a class that's going to be giving us D10 hit points every level, that's going to be giving us heavy armor and shield. We're going to be using a shield, which means a better armor class. We are going to be having great saving throws and spreading those saving throws to other members of the party. We concentrated on charisma, and we raised our charisma before our strength to ensure that those saving throw bonuses were high for ourselves and for our fellow party members. And we're getting a number of versatile abilities in terms of healing, because we can do both our lay on hands, and we have a number of spells that heal, and we have a number of spells that do other things as well. And we have great maneuverability. So when it comes to being effective with damage, yes, this character is effective with damage, but we're adding it onto many additional things. And this build, frankly, could be done with any Paladin. Glory Paladin is what I used here, but if you wanted to use a different Paladin subclass, it would work, and the numbers would change a little bit, but it would work. There's no terrible Paladin subclasses, and I think Oath of Glory kind of goes down the middle, which is part of the reason I wanted to do this. The other reason I wanted to do this is Greek Warrior. So that is my Paladin build, 20 level straight Paladin. I probably won't be doing another 20 level straight Paladin build. This is the one where I can really kind of go through every option a Paladin gets and talk about them. So until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone. Talk to you next week.